Yeah, it's still very cohesive. So you wouldn't know if we hadn't had this discussion. But I will say my book is extremely fast paced. And if you're one of those people that loves like twists and turns and books that don't necessarily make sense until you have like an aha moment at the end, that's definitely this book. And in fact, I left some open-ended stuff in this one that gets solved in book 2 and 3. So even in my books, if something weird comes up where you're like, what was that? That was super weird. It's there on purpose. Everything in there has a purpose. Like I trimmed the fat on this book so much. So there is nothing in there that doesn't have a purpose for being there.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have an author on the show who loves working in Zoom just as much as I do because it's always so fun. You just never know if it's going to work or not. But we got it to work. We're here and we are choosing to slay this podcast. And then I'll refer to the book here in a moment. Emrie's here with us. We're excited to have her here on the show. Author of the book. I'm holding it up here. And if you're listening, that's it right here in my hand. It's amazing. It's beautiful. We're going to talk about the artwork and the story behind it and all things. Emrie on the podcast. Emrie, welcome to Living the Next Chapter.
Thank you so much for having me on. Sorry about giggling through your intro, but you're just so funny.
You can giggle away as much as you wish. That's it's a giggle available zone here on the podcast. I love it.
Good. I'm a permanent giggler.
Good. The cover of the book is beautiful, by the way.
Thank you.
Tell me about the artwork. Who's your amazing artist? Who is this?
That would be me. No, so after working 20 years in marketing and product development, this is, graphic design is a skill set that I've grown. And I was going to hire a professional book cover artist, but then I thought about it and I thought, I can do the art myself. And so I'll just give it a shot. I don't know, like the muse was inspired that day and everything I put together just kind of perfectly fit the book. And I worked a whole bunch of symbolism and runes into her dress. And, in the book, the main character also uses what are called seaxes, which are usually like either short or long daggers, basically. But it's a Viking weapon primarily. So that's what those two little daggers are on either side of her. She's got ravens in her wings. It's very book symbolism packed.
Very nice. Very nice. Tell everybody where you are in this big world of art.
I am in Colorado in the mountains in the United States.
It's like a terrible place to live. Too much gorgeous landscape around you. That sounds beautiful there.
It's awesome. And the only downside is we get wildfires and bears, in mountain lions and bobcats. And randomly I had a moose show up like in the middle of the night. It set off our perimeter alarm because we have an alarm to keep our animals safe. Usually it scares off bears and stuff. And it was kind of funny because at 3 a.m. there was a giant moose just staring at the camera. But yeah, it's interesting to live up here.
There you go. Great. When did your journey as an author begin?
Unofficially, it started probably about 6 years ago, but officially it really started about 3 years ago, maybe 4. I had this crazy dream one night and I woke up and told my husband about it. And he's like, you need to make that into a movie. And I was like, I don't know anything about making a movie, Nick. That's absurd. Why would I do that? And then he said, well, you're a really good writer, so maybe you should write a book. And I was like, yeah, maybe. And then I sat down one day and I wrote out probably the first 3 chapters. And then life hit and I went through the worst period of time in my entire life, just as far as loss and grief and just chaos. And then at the back end of that, I had a spiritual awakening, and that spiritual awakening, weirdly enough, kind of coincided with the dream that I had. And so I realized that I needed to buckle down on it. And so I dropped everything I was doing and decided to be an author. And now this work of love is out in the universe. So I guess it was a good thing.
Amazing. Okay. So I would love hearing anything I can hear from my author read to me by the author. So can you read me? I'm reading it with you right now, but can you read me the back cover of your book? Can you read that to me? Because I think I'm going to
apologize ahead of time because you can probably tell I speak really quickly. And so this might sound like Ben Shapiro is reading this or an auctioneer.
Sold. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So the blurb goes, from felling dead trees in the Colorado Rockies to slitting the throats of her enemies, Anya had her work cut out for her. Too bad the Norse gods don't offer paid time off. After a premonition of a terror attack nearly kills her, the god Odin jolts Anja into a violent and confusing spiritual awakening. Seeking answers, she travels to the world's most exclusive school for magic concealed beneath Copenhagen. Immediately thrust into a world of dark magic and global conspiracy, Anja discovers she's no mere mortal, but the incarnation of a Valkyrie. With the help of Cole, a charming CIA agent, and the school's eccentric professors, Anja unravels a sinister plot. The Dark Queen and her putrid army are planning a siege on humanity. Anja must thwart the carnage, not only for Midgard's sake, but to prevent all of the 9 realms from plunging into eternal darkness. There's just one problem. There's no manual on how to be a Valkyrie. Chooser of the Slain is a dark fantasy thriller packed with magic, Norse mythology, gore, dark humor, and a cast of lovably complex characters. With copious twists and turns, this book will keep you guessing until the end.
Nice. See? Now there, if that wasn't enough for you to click purchase or add to cart, I don't know what it was. That's amazing. Okay.
You'll notice I said her name both Anya and Anja. I did that on purpose because the actual German pronunciation of her name is Anja, but I actually named her after an American friend of mine, who I guess is of German lineage, who spells it the same way, but she goes by Anya. So either way you want to call that character, that's fine.
Okay,
I had some people go, is it Anja or Anya? And I'm like, it's both. It's whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, when I was looking at it, Antje, I'm like, Angie? And a G? I'm like, so I'm glad you did that. That's great. Because that'll help people that are not unfamiliar with that name. I'm like, that makes sense now. I love that.
Well, I was corrected by a German person. So she read it and I said, yeah, Anya. And she said, it's pronounced Anja. It's a German name. And I was like, okay, but I have a friend who lives here who is of German descent, who has that name spelled that way. And she goes by Anya. So then when I asked her, I said, hey, is your name Anya or Anja? And she said, it's actually Anja in German, but I go by Anya because it's just, Anja is such a weird name for Americans to pronounce.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of what we do to names. Yeah. That's great.
Just butcher them, it's just the American way.
So the first 3 chapters came really quick for you?
Yes, the rough outline of them came really quickly. I got really into writing it, and then just life happened, and it was way too much to deal with.
Yeah,
but I'm appreciative of it because if I hadn't gone through that, there's no way I would have quit my job and become an author.
So how much space and time was between chapter 3 and chapter 4?
Ooh, probably 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I kept trying to sit down and write, and I would reread the first 3 chapters and be like, wow, this is great. I can't believe I wrote this. And then I would get to chapter 4 and I was just like, meh, it was just blank.
Really?
Yeah, I think I just, some people really excel at writing when they're going through something. I'm not one of those people. So when I go through something, my brain can't quite tap into that like creative frequency that you can get into where you just like the muse is active. Because for me, there is a very specific thing that happens when I'm writing and I'm in the right headspace for it. It's almost like a stream of consciousness. There's not a whole lot of, oh, well, should I make his eyes green or brown? It's like I see the whole story in my head and I can just literally write down what I'm seeing, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm going through something, like if I'm going through a trauma, I can't get into that frequency. It's very hard for me. I can paint and whatever, but writing, not so much.
I think as a reader, we have this idea that you just write all the chapters at once and the book is done. That's how a book is done, right? So the fact that you have a big gap in chapter 3 to 4, like you're a different person from chapters 1, 2, and 3 than you are in chapter 4.
So it's kind of funny that you said that. Because I think I'm a little esoteric and weird, so I'm just going to tell listeners that ahead of time. I'm very huge into spiritual things. So a lot of the things that I say and a lot of things that I write in this book are definitely coming from a spiritual lens. I think I had to go through that loss, that heartache, that pain, and then start to heal myself and work through that trauma and that grief and everything else before I could write the story I needed to write. I just didn't have the perspective before all of that happened to be able to write this book. So I am a different person, although who I am today went back through and edited 1 through 3. So it's not like you get like an AC/DC, like, wow, a whole other author wrote this. Um, but I was in a very different place in my life and just in a very different place, like of consciousness. I was very much in like I call it automatic mode, where you're just really functioning. You're just responding to life. It's nothing but a response to stimuli. So my first three chapters, I was in that headspace while I was writing that. And then chapters 4 through, I think it's 25 total. So 4 through the end, I was in a completely different headspace. I was in a place where I had gratitude for life, where I had gratitude for the trauma I'd been through. I had gratitude for everything. And I understood its purpose. So I understood why those traumas happened. And if I hadn't gotten to that place of self-development work, basically, this book would be it'd be grimdark rather than dark fantasy. You know, it'd be like so depressing and violent that the ending would be horrible. Everyone would be sad. Everyone would be like, gosh, this woman is a downer, you know? So
Okay,
I'm a big fan of it being a different person.
so through that whole time frame then of writing the book, lots of changes happened for you. If you weren't an author and you weren't writing a book at the time, would you be at the same spot you are today?
Probably yes. And the only reason I'm saying that is because you know, the changes that happened were like my dad died and my grandmother died and my dog of 13 years died. And then another dog of ours died right after that. And this was all over like, I think 6 months. And then my house almost burned down because Cameron Peak, which is the largest wildfire in Colorado history, was on our doorstep for like 3 months. And with like really strong winds up here, because it gets very windy up here. And, you know, when winds pick up like that, like fires can blow through several miles in a day. So I was constantly living under threat of like losing the home that we had just bought, that we dumped all of our money into at the time. My biggest client, because of COVID, dropped like all of their consultants. So I lost my biggest form of income. I mean, it was literally just my entire life just went up in flames. No pun intended. So, you know, on the tail end of that, and I was having some other issues with like my birth family. So, you know, after my dad died, it really changed the dynamic. But really after he got sick, because he had a stroke, a really bad one beforehand. And I went and took care of him for a couple months back in Atlanta, where I used to live, where my parents lived. And so I changed the family dynamic. And so I also was like isolated from the rest of my family. And so really, I just felt very alone and very honestly, just like, what is the point of this? Like, this is all painful. Life is just nothing but suffering. When is it ever going to get better? My whole life has been like this. Oh, I hate it here. You know, it was like that. I was in that mentality. And so if I hadn't had that stuff happen, and I wouldn't have grown from it. But even if I had been not writing this novel, just that amount of loss and trauma, it made me hit rock bottom finally. And once I hit rock bottom, that was when I turned inward and went like, I have some real stuff I need to work on.
Yeah.
Because perspective is everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Because this writing your novel could be one of the tools in your toolbox to kind of navigate all these changes in your life as well. It's just another thing to kind of preoccupy you and maybe redirect your frustrations, your energy in those times when you need that.
I think that's true for a lot of authors. I don't really work that way though.
Okay.
So I really mean it. When I'm like going through something that's kind of dark or heavy, my creativity takes a total nosedive. Like I'm not for some reason, and it's frustrating because my husband's the opposite. Like when he's suffering through something, he has this like art helps him. You know, it's a good way of expressing himself and working through it. And I think that's true for an inordinate amount of authors. I'm not one of those. My creative, I guess, like brain just shuts off and will not turn back on again until I found some semblance of like resting place where I can feel okay again. So that's why there was that huge gap, is just I would sit down to write and nothing would come out.
Well, I think there's a lot of authors that I talk to who get frustrated in that moment because they feel like they should be writing, but they can't. And then they feel like they're failing as an author, they're failing as a writer, because everybody tells you 1,000 words a day. If you're not doing that, you're not writing. And they're like, well, I can't write now. You know, so you're telling us we have permission to take a break.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Right? Come on.
Not even just permission. In my case, like I could not have written this book. I love this book. There's not a thing about this that I would change. And so, yeah, I'm a perfectionist, so that's saying a lot. But if I had forced myself to sit down and write 1,000 words, I would have come up with a very different story that wouldn't have been the message I wanted to put out into the world. And I'm a big believer in, I'm trying to figure out how to word this so it doesn't sound too woo-woo. I'm a big believer in letting like life guide you. And if things become a struggle to the point of where you're beating yourself up over them, I usually see that as the universe being like, time to take a pause on this. Go do something else. Go do something that you do feel inspired to do. Go do something that is going to help, raise your spirits or your vibration or whatever you want to call it, into where then you feel motivated and inspired to write again. But this whole like hustle thing of like write 1,000 words, I didn't get bent, like don't tell me what to do. My creativity doesn't work on a schedule. I don't really know most people who do have creative, I guess creative endeavors that they could just like flip on and off like that. Usually it's you're inspired to work on them or you're not. And inspired work just hits very differently. So yes, you could push through. Yes, you can write that 1,000 words a day, but is it going to be your best work? Probably not. Probably not, because you're not in that inspired headspace. And like I said, when I get into that headspace, it is like stream of consciousness. I would almost say it's like I'm channeling the universe when I do that, because I'm not consciously coming up with the story. It's being written through me. And I have talked with several other authors who know exactly the headspace that I'm talking about. So if you're not in that headspace, I'm not a big fan of forcing it. I have sat down and forced it a few times, and every time I end up rewriting those scenes. So I learned my lesson on that.
Okay. So for the reader that's listening, they're maybe never going to write the book themselves. They're here to fall in love with you as an author.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the book. What is your big wish for the readers, kind of your love letter to a reader? Explain to the reader from the author's perspective what this book is about and why it's in the world.
Okay. So this is what I call Thera-tainment. Yeah. Okay. So basically, this book is filled with a bunch of dark stuff that's meant to trigger things that you've experienced. It's meant to make you feel crappy in that moment. It is meant to bring all of that stuff up to the surface so that you can look at it, but so that you can look at it through the lens of another character. So maybe it's not so intense for the reader. My biggest hope in this for readers in general is, one, I bring back like that belief that you had as a child that there was magic out in the world. And I'm not talking about, like you can burst a ball of fire into flames in your hand, like not that kind of magic, but the kind of magic that makes you cross paths with the right person at the right time, or the kind of magic that makes you sit down and write a book out of thin air, or the kind of magic that just you're having a horrible day and then a feather floats through the air and like you just feel better because you feel like someone acknowledged that you were having a crap day and that they're there with you. That kind of magic. That magic exists in this world. And I think a lot of people have become so habituated to their logical brain being like, well, I can't explain it or I'll explain it away. But when you really open yourself up to the magic of life, you start to realize that there's a lot of stuff we can't explain. And maybe one day we will, and maybe it'll be explained through science. And at that point, that's awesome. But at this point now, it's still magic, right? And so it's okay to believe in that. It's okay to believe that there's more to this world than we know. And so that's one of the things I love about this book, is that a lot of it is based off of my own spiritual experiences, but put through like a fantastical lens. And I've talked to quite a few readers who I think picked up on that, because they said that. They're like, this almost reads like you experience these things. And I was like, well, I did some of them, in meditation. So I want that as well. But the big thing for me is I want people to be able to confront their demons in a safe space, where if it's too much, they can put the book down. And they're by themselves. So there's no shame if they start crying. There's no, not that there should be shame if people cry anyway, but that's just the world we live in. I want people to read this and look at their own experiences or their loved ones who have been through similar things. And then look at what the characters are going through and how they're struggling with their inner demons. And just to understand that, like, everybody goes through stuff. All of us, we all go through the darkness in life. Like, this is a dualistic world. We live in both light and dark. You just have to revel in both at the same time and understand there's a balance between the two. That's why there's so much hope in this book, and it's not a grimdark book.
There you go. There you go. Talk about your main character. If we were to meet this person, what would we know about them? What do we need to know about them before we read the book?
So Anya is very loosely based off of me when I was younger.
Okay.
And I say very loosely, but she's a reclusive U.S. forestry worker that lives in the mountains of Colorado. She is empathic and feels people's energy, which, again, I'm woo-woo, so just write it out with me. But I am very sensitive to energy. I can walk into a room and tell you who's having a bad day without even looking at them. So, and I'm fully aware of how this sounds, and I come from an R&D and marketing background. So for me, this was like, no, none of this is real. And then I started experiencing it after that really horrible year I told you about in 2020. And so, yeah, I had a spiritual awakening. And so I wrote my spiritual awakening into her character. So the beginning of this book is like just total chaos, and it's very ungrounding, and it's like you can't really get your situational bearings. And I did that on purpose. I wanted people to know what a spiritual awakening feels like. Your whole world overnight changes, and you have no control over it, and you don't know what's going on, and it is terrifying. So
yeah,
there's quite a few things I'd like to come out of this book for readers, but that's definitely one of them. Anchi is she's a really badass character. I mean, yeah. I'm just going to say she is a strong female lead. She is fearless. She's a bulldozer. She goes through all sorts of stuff without pausing to think about it. And then that kind of catches up with her at some points, and she has to work through that. She's me. She's me when I was younger, for sure.
Okay. So as the author of the book, I find I've asked this question before, and I get a very interesting response from authors. If you were able to sit down with your main character and have a few moments to kind of ask them a question you don't know the answer to about them and their story, what question would you ask them?
Well, I have one, but it will ruin the story for listeners.
Okay, don't do that one.
I'm not gonna give that one. Wow, that's a hard one because it's based off of me, and I know myself so well. But
wow.
Wow, yeah. Without ruining the story, I don't have a good one for that because the only thing that happens to her that I don't know about is a plot point.
Okay, well then we're not going to spoil that. So that tells everybody to go read the book. There you go. That's a good.
I deeply know my main character because it's me. So
excellent. That's good. So that's a great response. I like that. That's a great response. You said you're out doing promotions about the book. You had a really good event happened recently. Can you talk about that a little bit? I think we want to encourage the authors to get out in public and talk about your book. What happened for you?
So I had two big events back to back. I went and did one at a nearby 4th of July thing, which is like a huge celebration here for our country. And I'd had probably 40 people buy my book in a matter of, just a few hours, along with merch, and people really excited to talk about the book. And I also have a children's sci-fi fantasy novella that I'm not really promoting. I'm not doing anything behind it. It's written under a different pen name because it's children's. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to accidentally traumatize a child. They pick up like my dark fantasy book and be like, Mom, what is this?
Yes.
So I sold a ton of copies of that as well, which that one's like a little love project for me because it's about grief for little kids. It explains it through the lens of quantum physics, but dumbed down onto a kid level so they can understand what's going on. So that was crazy because I just brought those like on a whim thinking like, oh, no one's going to buy this. And then I sold out of them halfway through and I thought, oh my gosh, I should have brought more. So that was a crazy event. And then this past weekend, I went to Barnes & Noble, which was my big book signing that I was nervous about because it's this big corporate entity here. Do you guys have Barnes & Noble up in Canada?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So it's this huge chain. For anyone who lives in the UK, I don't think you guys do have this chain, but it's a massive chain. These bookstores are overwhelmingly huge. It would take me like years to be able to look at the back of every book that's in that store. So I came in. And I set up, I hired Vikings, actually.
Hang on, you hired Vikings.
Okay. I did. There's a local reenactment equestrian theater troupe here in Colorado that does like, Renaissance festivals and that kind of thing. They do sword fighting and jousting, like actual jousting, not LARPing. They actually get injured quite a bit. So I reached out to this company because someone who worked at my vet was part of their troop, and they lent me to rent a Vikings for the day. And so that was fantastic because they were in full Viking garb. My audiobook narrator, who is amazing, who also has appeared on your show, Chris
Yes.
Turek. Oh yeah, his booming voice.
Amazing.
Oh, he's my audiobook narrator. And if you think his like normal booming voice is great, you should hear him with all of the different accents. He's a one-man theater troupe. I cannot praise him enough. I love that guy.
He's so good.
Yeah. Oh, and he's such a nice guy. We hooked up through Audible. This is like a total side note, but this is kind of a fun story. So we hooked up on Audible, and I heard a couple of his chapters on different books, and I fell in love with his voice immediately. So I reached out to him. He was the very first guy I reached out to. And I said, hey, I'm a new author. I know this is kind of a risk, but will you be my audiobook narrator? Because I think you're amazing. And he was like, yeah, sure. And then I realized that I wrote this crazy international book with an international cast of characters with like 20 different accents. And I thought, oh my God, this guy's gonna hate me. He nailed them. He did them so perfectly. And so while we were talking, because I was like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. I can't believe you nailed that. I was like, where do you live? And turns out he lives like an hour away from me.
No.
Wild, right? Which in America is like unheard of. So yeah. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that you live that close. And so she came down for my book signing and actually did a live reading in Barnes and Noble.
Come on.
Of the only family-friendly chapter we could find. So he did a reading and it was fantastic. I could hear him, in his Irish Philomena voice. Philomena is an Irish druid. She's an elderly Irish druid woman who is hilarious in my book. I could hear her yelling throughout the store at one point. It was hilarious. It was so fun. And then I also baked cookies from scratch, and because they were made of chocolate, island coconut, and almond, I named them the CIA cookie.
Nice.
Yeah. And then the secondary layer to the story on that was that they were brownies masquerading as a cookie, because they really do taste like brownies. So I just had lots of fun stuff like that. And I sold out of all my books. And then I even brought hardcovers with me, like a few of them, I think I brought 5, thinking like, yeah, people probably aren't going to buy 5 of them. I sold through those too. It was so good that the store staff actually came over afterward because I offered them cookies and some free books. And they were like, this is like the most successful signing we've had at the store. Like, this was crazy. People were super excited to read your book once they picked it up and brought it up to the register. And I was like, that makes me feel so good as a new indie author, because they have like traditional authors come in all the time. So for me to have a wildly successful signing on my first try was fantastic. And then the events coordinator messaged me a few days later and said, do you want to come back in November? Which is perfect because I have a second book that's dropping. I'm going to plug this right now. I have a second book that's dropping in November. It's actually dropping on Dia de los Muertos because it is set in Mexico during Dia de los Muertos. So it kind of worked out perfectly. I'm going to have a nice little launch party. And of course, I'll have a face painter doing like, La Katrina.
Of course.
Why wouldn't I? Yeah. All about making a spectacle. It's fun.
So, okay, jump back to Chris as your voice actor for your book. What is it like for you as the author to hear the voice of the people in your book, like your characters, to actually hear them? What does that feel like?
It's amazing. It made me, I could like talk about this for hours, so I'm trying to like condense my thoughts, but it made me love my book in a different way, because it's like, it's reading your book through the perspective of somebody else. So when he would read a line differently than how I had envisioned them saying it. And it was like either funny or it was sad when it was like, I saw it as a different thing. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting that he read it that way. So he and I would go back and forth on things sometimes I'm like, oh, and this one, she's like really angry. This isn't just like, oh, I'm kind of irritated. She's pissed about this. And so he would go back and re-record it. And I'd be like, oh, okay, I got it. But there were a couple of lines that when I wrote them, I was like, oh, those are kind of clever lines. But when he read them, his comedic timing is such that it made me laugh hysterically. My husband, too, we were both sitting in the living room listening to it on our speaker. And I was laughing so hard. I was like, that line didn't even make me laugh when I wrote it. It's just the way that he read it was so funny. So it's great because you get to see your story come alive through someone else's perspective. And it also made me think about the fact that, people read things differently. Yeah, and it kind of makes it make a little bit more sense to me because you'll see like people have just really varying opinions on characters, and not just in my book, just in general, in all books. You'll see people be like, I love this character. I hate this character. She's so whiny. They're like, no, she's sensitive and kind, and they're like really dueling perspectives on one character. And I started to realize it's probably because they're reading those lines differently. And so that was interesting for me through Chris. I got to kind of see that dynamic.
Yeah, so that's a good encouragement for people to do an audio version of your book, is to hear it in real time and go. And I love the fact that you say that Chris brought out parts that you didn't anticipate. Like I do music, and we do music. We record a song. It's a song about A, B, and C, but somebody comes up and goes, "I love the song about G," and you're like, no, "We didn't write a song about G. We wrote a song about A, B, and C." But to them, they didn't even get what we were trying to write. They took it their own way. And it means something special to them. I love that.
Well, not only that, but like then you start looking at their perspective of the meaning of that, and you're like, oh my gosh, that does actually fit that. Right. I didn't see my own work from that perspective. That's crazy. And not only that, but I really would encourage people to do audiobooks. Like if you are an author and you're listening to this, it means so much to people who are dyslexic and blind to be able to enjoy your story. I had a conversation with a reader of mine who's blind, who was on social media and said, I'm blind. Do you have an audiobook? And I said, oh yeah, I do. And I'm actually so excited that you asked about it, because the whole reason I did this audiobook was for dyslexic and blind people, like visually impaired, people. And, she was like, honestly, that makes me feel so special. Like, thank you for that. She was like, just the fact that you were thinking of us, like actually makes me feel so much better today. So for us, it's like another avenue of income or whatever, I'm gonna like roll my eyes at that or whatever. But for people who have a hard time reading, either because they're visually impaired or they have dyslexia or they have eye tracking issues of some kind, an audiobook is like a life changer for them. And it really does allow them to enjoy your story.
Okay.
Plus also people are busy.
For the authors that are considering doing an audio version of the book, any tips? You found Chris, and I'm so happy you did. Any tips about finding somebody to do your voiceover work?
Hire Chris Turek.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, hands down.
There you go.
I would say if you're balking at it because you don't have the money, go on ACX and do like a royalty share. It's zero money out of pocket. You can find a really great, I found Chris, but truly you should hire Chris Turek. That's my advice.
Insert commercial here. Yes.
He's probably going to listen to this and turn beet red, because I'm always telling everyone, like, I could listen to this guy literally read like a Chinese takeout menu. I love his voice so much. I told his wife that. I was like, I could listen to him read anything. I don't know how you live with this guy. I would just be staring at him constantly.
How does that come out of your face? Yeah,
I did. Right. When I first met him and I realized that that's actually his real voice, he told me that. He told me it was his real voice, and I mentally understood that. But then we went out to dinner to celebrate the audiobook, and he opened his mouth, and I was like, that really is just his real voice. This isn't like he's putting on an act in an inner world. That is actually his voice. Anyway, and he's just great to work with. So I am going to plug Chris any chance I get.
All right, we'll put a link for Chris as well. I said to him, I told him he needs a podcast, is what I said. A voice like you could just talk about this. You could use it as a commercial to promote yourself. And he just looked at me like, really? I'm like, Chris, I would listen to you all day, every day, all the time, just to hear you talk.
I told him that too. I told him to start a YouTube channel of him reading like the old classics, the ones that are like public domain at this point. Yeah, I literally would listen to him read a takeout menu. So for me, I'm like, you should just do anything where you're talking. Anyway.
So, okay, talk about the new book that's coming up in the fall. Like, what's it about? How much can you tell us?
So I got to tap dance around this a little bit, because some of the things will ruin book one. So I'm going to give you a very vague outline. It is set in Mexico over Dia de los Muertos, as I mentioned. It not only brings in Norse mythology like book one does, but it also brings in Toltec mythology, which, if you don't know who the Toltecs are, they are a Mesoamerican people who were considered to be kind of like, I guess what we would consider like Atlanteans. They were like the tippy top of artistry and technology and all of this stuff. And then they just kind of collapsed and disappeared overnight. And a lot of their deities are actually the basis of like Aztec deities. So Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca are actually Toltec deities that then the Aztecs also worked into their own religious structure, basically. So it's really cool because it brings in, how do I explain this? It ties together Norse mythology and Toltec mythology. My goal in the rest of these books is to bring in as many mythologies as possible to show that a lot of religious beliefs and a lot of spiritual beliefs are really the same thing. They're just shown to you in a different way. They're shown to you in the way that you will most easily accept. And so, case in point is, in Norse mythology, Balder and Loki they're brothers. One is considerably the light brother. The other one is the darkness brother, right? So Loki is chaos and magic, and he is considered the dark brother. And then obviously Balder is almost like a Jesus character, and a Jesus archetype. So if you look at Toltec mythology, Quetzalcoatl is basically Balder, and Tezcatlipoca is basically Loki. They're the exact same story. They're just two totally different civilizations across the world from each other that saw a dualistic archetype, basically. So I drag a bunch of that into there. And then there's also some Greek mythology woven in there, but there's also a little bit of Greek mythology in book one. It's fun. It's a fun one. Very violent. I will tell you that my books are extremely violent. So if you're not a fan of violence, this is probably not the book for you.
Okay. See, that's good to know. Right.
Yeah. Zero spice though. There's no smut in there. I know that a lot of fantasy right now, for some reason, has got nothing but smut in it, but there is zero smut in my books. Yeah. And there will be zero smut in my books ongoing. So it's just not something I like writing.
So we know the connection between book one and where you are in the world. What's the connection between book two and the world? Like, how are you connected? And why is that kind of your... Can you tell us? I don't want to give any away. Okay.
No, I've been to Mexico a lot. And actually growing up, I had kind of a second family that were Mexican. They worked for my parents. And I hope they're listening to this because I love them and I miss them immensely. But Soledad and Diego were like my second set of parents. And Maria was like probably my older sister that I definitely emulated for about 10 years because I thought she was so cool. So a little bit of it is my love letter to them and their culture and just my love of Mexico. But the biggest connection between these, and really this is for the rest of the book, so I'll just kind of share my plan for that. I want to use massive spiritual sites to connect our realm to the other realms because my book is set partially in our realms and partially in the Norse realms. So you get like modern fantasy or modern thriller really is what is going on in our part of the book. And then you get high fantasy because it takes you into the Norse realms or the Greek realms or, the Toltec realms, although there's not a lot of that in this book. This one is primarily centered here with traveling into Helheim, which is the Norse like realm of the dead, basically.
Is there any other type of genre that you would it makes you curious and you would consider writing in just for fun? Like that would be interesting. I'd like to do a cookbook or something. Like, is there anything else that you're like caught your eye that you just go, maybe one day?
So my husband is continuously telling me to do a cookbook. It's kind of funny that you brought that up. I do like sci-fi. And even this book even has like a couple tiny elements of sci-fi in it. And then I wrote that kid's book that's like the sci-fi fantasy. So I think I'm a sci-fi fantasy person. I guess maybe I could write like a rom-com type book. But I like really imaginative, creative genres. And I think that sci-fi and fantasy lends themselves well to that. I take that back. Maybe historical fiction. And the only reason I say that is because I actually do have an idea for, I don't know if you've ever heard of Barbora I can't even say it right. Celjska, I think is how you say it, or the Black Barbora. She's an old Czech, like queen, basically, that they treated terribly. She was like seen as doing witchcraft and like all this horrible stuff. And as it turns out, she was actually a really good queen who like sacrificed a ton for her people. So one day I think I'm going to tell her true story, but maybe through a fantastical lens.
Well, that's good to know. See, I like when authors dream, because you never know what that could lead to, right? Or it might end up in part of the story somewhere else.
Yeah.
You just see that piece of yours, like, huh, I'm curious about that. I'm going to put that on the sidelines. I'm going to keep working. It just kind of just sits there and goes, what about me? What about me? That's like,
Yeah, I think
interesting.
that's sci-fi for me.
Yeah.
And that's part of it because like I have a science background, right? And when I worked in product development, I literally worked with a bunch of chemists all day. So
Yeah.
for me, sci-fi makes, and I'm married to an engineer who literally works on rockets. So
Well, that helps. Yeah.
yeah, so that's like kind of part of my life already. And my dad worked at NASA when before I was born. So like I definitely have a lot of like aerospace just background in my family. I mean, even my grandfather worked in tooling for Lockheed Martin. So he also worked in aerospace. And my other grandfather was in the Air Force. So another aerospace thing. So I think for me, the things that I know are what I want to write about because I have enough context to be able to do it justice.
Any other authors that influence you as a writer?
Neil Gaiman, big time.
Well, that was a fast answer.
Yeah, I love Neil Gaiman. I love Neil Gaiman, and I actually watched his masterclass right before, not before, I started getting back into writing, and I was having like a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of imposter syndrome, because I was like, I'm writing this weird genre bender, and I gave it to a friend thinking that like she would enjoy it. She kind of didn't, and so it really like took the wind out of my sails. It's just not her genre. And like now that I passed that and I've had like literally probably 100 people read this book at this point and rave reviews from so many of them. It's just not her genre. And sometimes that just happens with books. Like it will not be a book for you. And other people may love it. And you might be like, what the hell is wrong with me? I don't like this book, but it happens. So readers, don't feel bad about having your tastes. And if you hate a book, do not force yourself to finish it. There are billions of books out there, some of which you will fall absolutely in love with in the first 3 chapters. So like if you, my rule is if I get 100 pages into a book and I don't like it, I don't finish it. Because for me, it's like 100 pages into a book is for me, at least an hour, hour and a half of my time. That's as long as I would give a movie. So if I don't like the story in the amount of time it takes me to watch an entire movie, which is an entire story, like I'm not going to invest any more time into it. Time is the most precious commodity we have. So I just wanted to put that out there because I feel like a lot of readers pressure themselves to finish books that they hate. And I don't think you should do that if you don't want to. Yeah, not unless like sometimes you'll hear people say like, oh, the first half of the book is really slow, but like wait until the end because that's when it all comes together and it all makes sense. Sometimes those books are worth waiting for, but if it's not one of those books, like don't pressure yourself to finish it. I'm telling you that as an author too. If you got 100 pages into my book and you hate it, I don't want you to finish the rest of it and then resent me for taking 8 hours of your life away, So that's my general stance on that. I got totally sidetracked because I started talking about that. So Neil Gaiman. So I was having a little bit of imposter syndrome and I watched his masterclass, and his masterclass was so inspiring and he was so genuine about write your story. He's like, somebody will like your story. He's like, keep submitting because someone will be drunk or desperate for a story or whatever, and they'll publish it for you. So just keep trying. And I did. And I have, had tons of pieces published in literary magazines and journals and newspapers. And so he's really kind of like what got me over that hump. And then I love his writing style. He leans almost a little purpley. Do you know what that means?
No, I'm curious now.
Okay. So purple writing is like very flowery, descriptive writing, and it's usually set in a negative connotation, but I like that kind of writing. That's the kind of writing I like to read. This like new standard of dumbing down your writing and not using, I'm going to call them SAT words, but not using like, 4-syllable words because people don't know what it means. I hate that trend. I am bucking it. I'm glad that Neil Gaiman bucks it. I think everyone should buck it. I love reading books where I learn something I didn't know when I think I'm just getting entertainment. Neil Gaiman's great with that. He's great at painting a picture. He's really inventive. And his stuff leads a little dark like mine, but there's always hope in it. And I think that's the world needs more of that. The world needs to, without going off on a tirade, but our society like really is like, just focus on the good or just focus on the bad. Like there's no balance between the two. And the thing is like, you're going to go through darkness and you can't avoid that in this world. And if you only focus on the light side of things, you're going to be really upset or unprepared when darkness hits. So it's better that you familiarize yourself with the darkness so that you know how to get out of it and go back into the light side of life. And I'm using dark and light in this as like a bit of a metaphor, I guess, for life. But really what it is it's being in a state of hope or being in a state of hopelessness. And so I think it's really important that more and more people read dark books that have a lot of hope in them. That's how you get through life. That's how you get through life without hitting rock bottom like I did.
That is interesting. And it goes parallels back to what we talked about earlier around your character development, about having the good and the bad and the dark and the light. It just came full circle there in the conversation.
Most of my stuff comes full circle because it's, this was a labor of love for me. All of my books will be. So just if you are reading or listening to this and you do decide to read my books, just know that I have like literally poured my heart and soul into that. And I hope that you get something out of it that helps you enjoy life a little bit more or understand how to deal with whatever it is that you're dealing with. That's my hope.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge the readers to read more than 100 pages of your book as they go, because between chapter 3 and 4, there's a big gap there. And there's a lot of things have happened between those pages. Between the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4. So I would tell you to read at least into chapter 4, chapter 5 before you're like, okay, that's what I would encourage everyone, because there's a story behind that. And I don't think a lot of people would know that at first glance, looking at the book, thinking, they have no concept about what happens behind the scenes. So it's good.
Yeah, it's still very cohesive. So you wouldn't know if we hadn't had this discussion, but I will say my book is extremely fast paced. And if you're one of those people that loves like twists and turns and books that don't necessarily make sense until you have like an aha moment at the end, that's definitely this book. And in fact, I left some open-ended stuff in this one that gets solved in book 2 and 3. So even in my books, if something weird comes up where you're like, what was that? That was super weird. It's there on purpose. Everything in there has a purpose. Like, I trim the fat on this book so much. So there is nothing in there that doesn't have a purpose for being there.
I love when authors hide something in the book, just like a little guilty pleasure that it's like when you talk to a reader and you ask them where they are in the book, they're like, oh, I'm on chapter 5. You're like, oh, wait till you get to chapter 6. There's this, you're going to hit this turn going to happen. Oh, I can't even tell you. But you do that little thing, you hide stuff in there.
But I would say probably, absolutely. And I would say that those twists and turns that you're talking about probably happen every other chapter in this book.
Oh, good. See, good.
Like one of my favorite pieces of feedback I got from this was actually from a neighbor of mine who is a big reader, but he's a dude. Okay. So I wasn't expecting for him to love this book so much because I guess I just kind of assumed I'm a female. I'm probably writing for females. Most of the people who have fallen absolutely in love with this book to the point where they've read it multiple times now have all been guys. Women really like this book, but this does something else for guys, which is crazy because it's a female main character. But he came to me afterward and he handed me back the book that I lent him because I had printed out my book in a hardcover copy the first time to let beta readers read it. And he was beta reading for me. And he read it and he brought it back to me and he goes, I love this book because like I couldn't put it down. He was like, it was like literally addictive. He was like, every time I thought I knew what was going to happen, it didn't happen that way. And then he was like, and then something else happened. And then he was like, I literally went to bed thinking like, well, I need to know what happens next now. And I was like, that's what I was going for. Cause that's what hooks me. I can't do books where the first like 200 pages are nothing but exposition. That will make me quit a book faster than anything. I want you to punch me in the face with action and get me hooked on it so that I want to know what's going to happen next. And then you can start, bringing me into the world a bit more. But, and I will say like, I'm not denigrating people who do world building. There's a lot of world building in this book, but I can't handle big chunks of it in the beginning. You got to suck me in immediately. I'm a low attention span person when it comes to beginning of books.
It's good. I want you to come back in the fall and celebrate book
Yeah,
2.
for sure.
That would be great. But as far as connecting with you, I have your Instagram page up while we're chatting. Great pictures here about all the things you're up to. But where do
Yeah.
we go to connect with you, and website, all that great information?
Okay. So my author website is esoliver.com. My small publishing website, which is the publishing company that me and my husband own, and we are currently in talks about acquiring other books. So keep an eye out there. Yeah, I wanted to be the change I wanted in the world, right? I don't. Traditional publishing is a quagmire of stupidity. I'm going to be honest with you, and it's also just there's so much unnecessary gatekeeping. There are so many good stories that really have a place in the world, but are so unique and different from what, the derivative mass market, I guess, ideal is, or the low hanging fruit, that they never really even get a chance. So I'm writing my books, and then I'm going to try and bring on some other books that are unique and probably wouldn't make it in traditional publishing, but are a labor of love that have a great story to tell. So that website is shadygrovecreative.com. And then you can find me on, Instagram, Facebook, and then Shady Grove Creative has a YouTube channel that has all of my book trailers on it and teasers, because I'm big on doing media, cinematic trailers for books and things.
Okay. So before we go, talk about that, because I don't hear a lot of people talking about book trailers where you're explaining it. The advantages, talk about that a little bit before we leave.
So this was something I actually didn't know I could do, and then was very proud of myself once I finished it. I was like, I had no idea I could do that. And as it turns out, I'm actually pretty good at this. I like book trailers because rather than me telling you a blurb, which really gives you kind of this like 3,000-foot point of view of the book, it doesn't really give you the feel of it or any sort of like kind of inkling of what you're getting into, really. Book blurbs for me don't really work usually. I'm going to be honest. I'll be like, I guess it sounds okay. And then I get into the book. I'm like, wow, this wasn't what this book was about. This book was great, and the blurb was meh. So I kind of feel that way about blurbs. I had a really hard time writing mine too. I hate writing blurbs. I loathe it. I will write an entire book before I'll write a blurb.
And I made you do that at the beginning. I love that.
Oh man, I reworked that blurb like 20 times and I still don't like it. So
there you go.
I decided to create a cinematic trailer for it, and I have a 2-minute cut and a 30-second cut. The point of the book trailer for me was to get the reader into an immersive state of understanding what the book was about. There's like tone in there. There is a reference to violence, so they know it's going to be a very violent book. There, because I have multi-ethnic characters in there, I have, people represented on the screen to show that. It just gives you more insight into a book in 30 seconds than I think a blurb does. And I really like it because at book signings, when people are like, what's your book about? They start watching the 30-second trailer. And I would say like probably 95 to 98% of people, and like that's a guesstimate, obviously, but it is very rare. Most people, when they watch the book trailer, are like, all right, I'm going to buy the book. So versus me like explaining what it's about this, and then and then she goes to Copenhagen, and because she had a spiritual awakening, and I get there the whole spiel, and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm like, there's a book trailer. That I watched the book trailer, like sold. So for me, I like book trailers because it communicates more information than just reading it alone in the same amount of time.
Okay, that's good. I'm going to definitely go right now and watch. As well as I hold the book in my hand, I'll watch the video. That's great. I love it. So come back, please, in the future.
Of course. This was great.
This is good. I would love to maybe invite Chris on at some point, too. Maybe the three of us have a conversation. That'd be
that would be hilarious.
Thing, right? But yeah, so Chris, if you're listening, thank you for all of this amazing stuff you've done to help. authors. And I'm so glad that you guys connected and
Me
that
too.
you offered him over to me to come over on my show. That was a great connection. So thank you for that.
Of course. Like I said, I will talk Chris up to literally anybody. That's
Excellent.
that is how much I enjoyed working with him. So,
So as you come across other authors that want to come work with you, please keep
oh
us in
yeah,
mind here on the podcast.
for
We'd love
sure.
to have them come on and promote their books and what they're doing. We'd love to have any of the people you work with to come this way as well.
Oh, absolutely. If we pick up another author, I will absolutely put them on your show immediately.
Excellent.
So,
I appreciate that. Thank you for the book.
of
Thank you for
course.
doing all this great stuff in the world. I'm looking forward to book 2. So keep us in mind.
Thank you. Of course. Thank you again for having me on.
All right, everybody, as always, all the information is in the show notes. Make sure you go and leave an amazing review when you buy your book, whether that's in person, online, wherever you do that, please do that so people know that this book is for them. And yeah, lots of good stuff for you to follow up with here. Emrie, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for being here for the Living the Next Chapter podcast. So glad to have you as part of our family of listeners. There's a seat for you just here on Living the Next Chapter, and I'm so happy that you have listened to all the way to the end. Wow, you are now my new bestie. I want to let you know that I host 7 other podcasts on top of Living the Next Chapter. Yep, 8 total. One of them is called the How To Podcast series. If you are thinking, you know what, Dave, this podcast thing seems like a lot of fun, well, I'll give you a secret. It is. It's a great, amazing, fun time where you can get to meet great people, get your word out there, promote your book, promote what your coaching program, whatever you're doing. Podcasting is great. And if you want to learn how to do this, what you're hearing right now, head over to howtopodcast.ca and look up the How to Podcast series on YouTube, whatever app you're listening on. You'll find me there. And I'd love for you to come listen to how to do this. And if you're interested and have questions on how to podcast, reach out to me at howtopodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. Talk soon.